The blood hit the floor before anyone moved. A gurney crashed through the ER doors at 11:47 p.m., and the man on it was already dying. 3 bullet wounds, no ID, no pulse history, and a blood pressure reading that made the monitor scream. Nurse Mara Calloway had her hands on him before the wheels stopped rolling. That's when Sergeant Boyd Mercer shoved her. Not grabbed, not stopped. Shoved. Both hands, hard enough to send her into a metal supply cart that rattled across the tile like a gunshot. Back off, nurse. This one's ours. The ER froze. 14 people watched. Nobody said a word. What Sergeant Mercer didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that the woman he'd just put his hands on had once carried a wounded soldier 400 meters through live fire in a country most Americans couldn't find on a map. He thought he was putting a nurse in her place. He had no idea what he'd just started. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were dealing with, stay with me until the very end of this story. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The night started the way bad nights always did at Callaway Regional. Not with a single crisis, but with 4 of them arriving at once. Mara Calloway was already running by the time her shift hit the 2-hour mark. Trauma Bay 1 had a farm accident. Middle-aged man with a degloving injury on his forearm that made 2 interns go pale. Bay 2 had a pediatric respiratory case. 6-year-old girl, lips faintly blue, mother speaking no English and gripping her daughter's hand like letting go would end the world. Bay 3 was a psych hold waiting on evaluation, a young man who'd walked into traffic twice and kept asking for water. And the waiting room. The waiting room had 23 people in it and a woman in the back corner who'd been there for 3 hours with a towel pressed to her head and had stopped making eye contact with the triage desk. Mara clocked all of it in 40 seconds flat. She was not the charge nurse. She was not the attending. She was a staff RN working a night shift in Harker, Montana. Population 31,000, nearest Level 1 trauma center, 112 miles south. And tonight, Cascade Valley Medical Center was holding together with the medical equivalent of rubber bands and prayer. Mara. Desmond, the charge nurse, caught her arm as she came out of Bay 2. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, but his eyes were doing that thing they did when he was holding back something worse than what he was saying. We've got a problem incoming. Define incoming. Scanners picking up 3 units rolling code 3. Shooting at the truck stop on Route 9. Police said at least 2 victims, possibly related to... He lowered his voice. Something federal. That's all I got. Mara pulled on a fresh pair of gloves. How long? 4 minutes, maybe. She looked at the Trauma Bay layout. Bay 1 was occupied. Bay 2 was occupied. Bay 3 was occupied. The overflow hallway had 2 patients on gurneys and a teenager with a broken wrist who'd been waiting for ortho for 6 hours. Pull the psych hold to the side room, she said, and get someone to sit with the woman in the waiting room. She's been there too long with that head wound. I don't care who, grab a student if you have to. Desmond was already moving. Mara tied her hair back with the rubber band she kept around her wrist, rolled her sleeves down out of habit, trauma protocols, don't want bare arms near high splash zones, and positioned herself at the entrance to the trauma bay. 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, the ambulance bay doors blew open. The first gurney came in fast, paramedic calling out stats before the wheels cleared the threshold. Male, late 30s, GSW ×3, chest, left shoulder, lateral abdomen. BP's 60 over palp, sinus tach at 130, GCS 12 and dropping. 2 large bore IVs, 1 liter in, no response. Mara was already moving with the gurney. What's his name? No ID. Officer said he's a John Doe. Talks? Unknown. Found him at the truck stop. Only thing he had on him was... The paramedic hesitated, half a beat. The kind of hesitation that meant something was off. A phone encrypted, PD's got it. Mara filed that away. The man on the gurney was roughly 6 feet, lean and muscled in the specific way of someone who stayed fit professionally rather than recreationally. His face was turned to the side, jaw clenched despite his fading consciousness, and there was a scar along his left forearm, clean, surgical, the kind that didn't come from accidents. His hands, even now, were curled slightly inward. A posture, almost. She didn't think about it. She moved. Bay 1's clear in 6 minutes. We're taking Bay 4, she called. I need ONEG on standby, type and cross, CBC, BMP, coags, and get me Dr. Vance if he's still in the building. He left at 10, someone said. Then get me whoever's covering. Dr. Ansel Priya materialized out of the corridor. New hire, had been at Cascade Valley for 3 months, Harvard Med, fast hands, still a little too careful in the way that residents were careful before the real world knocked it out of them. Good enough. What do we have? He asked, pulling his stethoscope. Triple GSW, hypotensive, unknown background, no ID. Mara was already cutting through the man's shirt. He's losing pressure fast. I think we've got a hemothorax on the left side. Breath sounds are diminished. Priya listened. Agreed. Let's get a chest x-ray. Prep for possible chest tube. Already called. She didn't look up. The second ambulance had come in a minute behind the first with a police officer who'd taken a graze wound to his thigh. Not serious, plenty of noise. Got stabilized quickly and wheeled into a side bay where he immediately started making calls on his cell phone and asking for the sergeant in charge. That was when Sergeant Boyd Mercer arrived. He came through the ambulance bay entrance with 2 other officers, badge already out even though nobody had asked for it, moving through the ER like he'd decided the layout was his and everyone else was occupying it on his permission. He was tall, heavy-set in the neck and shoulders, with a face that had been weathered by about 15 years of believing that the uniform made the argument for him. Mara noticed him the way she noticed most things, peripherally, cataloged, low priority. She was wrong about the low priority part. Which one's the John Doe? Mercer asked nobody in particular, moving toward the trauma bays. Desmond stepped into his path. Not aggressive, just present. Sir, this is an active treatment area. I need you to check in at the... I know where I am. Mercer moved around him. Which bay? Sir. Mercer was already at the curtain for Bay 4. Mara was at the patient's side, hands in motion, monitoring the chest drain setup while Priya confirmed placement. She heard the curtain move and looked up. Family members and law enforcement need to wait at the nurse's station during active stabilization, she said. Her voice was flat and professional, the tone she used when she meant it, but wasn't interested in escalating. I'm not waiting anywhere, Mercer said. That patient is part of an active investigation. He's also in hypovolemic shock. She turned back to the patient. You can speak to the attending in approximately... I need you to step away from him. The room went very still. Priya looked up. The 2 nurses behind Mara stopped moving. Somewhere across the ER, another monitor continued its steady rhythm, indifferent. Mara didn't step away. She put her hand on the patient's wrist, pulse check, automatic, and said without turning around, That's not going to happen. Mercer moved. He came around the side of the bay, grabbed her by the arm above the elbow, and pulled. She hadn't expected it. Not because she was naive, but because even people who wanted to intimidate you usually did it with words first in a hospital. The physical contact was fast, aggressive, and it took her half a step before she caught her footing against the supply cart, which screeched back across the floor. The sound was what made the room freeze. Mercer stood with his hand still slightly extended, like he hadn't quite decided if he was done making his point. Mara stood against the cart. She hadn't made a sound. She hadn't grabbed anything. Her face was, and this was the thing people in the room would later struggle to describe, completely calm. Not stunned, not angry. Calm in the specific way of someone who had been in situations significantly worse than this one and had learned that reaction time was more valuable than reaction. You just put your hands on a nurse in an active trauma bay, Priya said from across the patient. His voice was shaking slightly. I need you to... Everybody stand down, Mercer said. He wasn't looking at Priya. He was looking at Mara. She straightened, pushed off the cart, and walked back to the patient's side. Ma'am, my name is Nurse Calloway. She picked up the chart. And my patient's pressure is dropping. So unless you have medical training and want to assist, I need you behind that curtain. Mercer stepped closer, close enough that she could hear the creak of his duty belt, the synthetic fabric of his jacket. He dropped his voice, not quieter exactly, but lower, the vocal equivalent of leaning your weight on someone. You think those scrubs make you untouchable? She looked at him then. Not long. 2 seconds. Maybe 3. I think my patient's going to die if I stop working, she said. And I think you know that. Something moved across his face. Not shame, not even hesitation, just recalculation. He stepped back through the curtain. Mara exhaled through her nose once and went back to work. For the next 47 minutes, she didn't think about Boyd Mercer. The patient's hemothorax was confirmed, the chest tube went in, the bleeding slowed enough to stabilize his pressure at 80 systolic, which was not good but was survivable for now. Priya called for a surgical consult. Mara updated the notes, cross-checked the IV fluid rates, and went out to check on her other patients. The pediatric case in Bay 2 had responded to the bronchodilator treatment. The little girl's lips were pink again, and her mother was crying silently in that particular way of relief that doesn't have any sound left in it. Mara squeezed the woman's shoulder as she passed. The farm accident in Bay 1 had gone to surgery. The woman in the waiting room with the head wound had, in fact, been forgotten for too long. Her laceration needed sutures and she had a mild concussion. Mara sat with her for 12 minutes, stitched the gash herself rather than waiting on the attending, and made sure someone called the woman's daughter before she left her alone again. She was charting at the nurse's station when Desmond appeared at her elbow. Administration called down. She kept typing. What did they want? They want to talk to you, tonight. He paused. Mercer filed a complaint. Says you interfered with a law enforcement operation and obstructed an officer during an active investigation. She stopped typing. He's saying you refused to comply with a lawful order to step back from the patient and that your actions compromise the integrity of the scene. Mara set her pen down. She picked it back up. She set it down again. He shoved me, she said quietly. I know. Into a supply cart. I know, Mara. In front of 11 people. I know. Desmond looked like he hadn't slept in a week, which was because he hadn't slept in a week. Administration is, they're not saying you did anything wrong. They're just saying that given the law enforcement complaint and the nature of the patient's situation, they need to put you on administrative leave while they review. Administrative leave. He couldn't quite meet her eyes. Temporarily. She looked at him for a long moment. Around them, the ER moved and breathed and beeped, and nobody looked at her directly, which meant everybody was watching. All right, she said. Mara. I said, all right, Des. She stood, smoothed her scrubs, picked up her badge lanyard. Who's taking my remaining patients? Quan and Reyes are splitting them. The little girl in Bay 2. Her mom doesn't speak English. Her treatment summary needs to go through the translation service, not Google Translate, because last month someone switched her allergy notation and I'll make sure. She nodded. She went to her locker, changed out of her scrubs into the jeans and gray pullover she'd worn in, and came back out. She didn't take anything else. Her locker had a photo of her brother on the inside of the door and a lucky quarter she'd been keeping since her 3rd deployment, but she left both of them. 2 security guards materialized at her sides as she reached the ER lobby. Not aggressive, they didn't touch her, but the positioning was deliberate, escort formation. Mara Calloway walked out of Cascade Valley Medical Center at 1:38 in the morning with her hands in her pockets and her face forward, and the automatic doors closed behind her with a sound like an exhale. In the parking lot, a man in a dark fleece jacket was standing near a black SUV, phone to his ear, watching the entrance. When she came out, he tracked her without moving. She noticed him. She kept walking. Her car was a 2014 Jeep with a cracked front bumper and a National Park sticker on the rear window that was peeling at one corner. She got in, started the engine, and sat in the parking lot with the heat blowing for about 3 minutes. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry exactly. There was something in her chest that was somewhere in between, a kind of pressure that she recognized as the feeling of being made small by someone who had no idea who they were making small, and the particular exhaustion of knowing that fighting it in the moment would have made everything worse. She'd learned that somewhere between Kandahar and her second re-enlistment. You picked your moments. She drove home. Her apartment was on the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian on Mill Street, 12 blocks from the hospital, and it was exactly as she'd left it. Dishes drying in the rack, 1 lamp on a timer by the window, a half-finished cup of tea on the counter that was now cold. She'd adopted a cat named Sargent. She thought this was funny when she named him and still thought it was funny, who appeared from behind the couch and rubbed against her shin once before going back to sleep. She sat at the kitchen table. She didn't turn on the TV. She didn't call anyone. She opened her laptop and looked at her email, but the only new messages were spam and a reminder about her vehicle registration, and she closed it. What she kept coming back to was the patient, not Mercer, not the suspension, the patient. There had been something about him, not just the scar, not just the condition of his hands, but the way he'd looked at her in those few seconds of consciousness before his pressure dropped and his eyes went glassy. Like he was trying to tell her something. Like recognition was fighting through the shock. She'd seen that look before. Not in a hospital. She went to bed at 3 a.m. and stared at the ceiling until 4:15 when she finally fell asleep. At 6:52 a.m., her phone rang. She was awake in under 2 seconds. Old habit, the kind that never fully left, and had the phone to her ear before the second ring finished. Calloway. She didn't say hello anymore. She'd stopped sometime around her second year back in civilian life when she realized most calls before 8 a.m. weren't social. Is this Mara Calloway? A woman's voice, controlled, professional. Not a reporter. Reporters talked faster, tried to fill silence. This woman was comfortable with silence. Who's calling? My name is Agent Diana Rourke. I'm with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's field office out of Great Falls. I'd like to ask you a few questions about the events at Cascade Valley Medical Center last night, specifically regarding the patient brought in at approximately 11:47 p.m. Mara sat up in bed. Through her window, the sky over Harker was the pale gray of early morning, and somewhere down the block a dog was barking at something it probably didn't understand. I was placed on administrative leave, she said. You should be speaking to hospital administration. I'm not speaking to hospital administration, Ms. Calloway. A pause. I'm speaking to you. Mara put her feet on the floor. The wood was cold. Why? Because the patient you stabilized last night is alive, Agent Rourke said. And the reason he's alive is you. And what we're learning about why he was at that truck stop in the first place is complicated. Another pause, shorter. And your name came up in a context that was not this hospital. The dog outside had stopped barking. What context? Mara asked. A classified one, Rourke said. I'd prefer to discuss this in person. Can you be at the Riverside Diner on 4th Street in 45 minutes? Mara looked at the window. The gray was lightening at the edges. Give me 30, she said. She was in her car in 11 minutes. Not because she was hurrying, but because she'd slept in her clothes. The Riverside Diner was the kind of place that had been in Harker since before anyone currently living in Harker was born, and it smelled like coffee and old grease and the particular warmth of a building that had kept people out of Montana winters for decades. Mara got there in 22 minutes, took a booth in the back with sightlines to both the door and the counter, and ordered black coffee. Agent Rourke arrived on time. She was mid-40s, close-cropped hair going silver at the temples, a dark blazer over a black turtleneck, and she moved through a room the way people moved when they were trained to notice exits. She slid into the booth across from Mara and ordered the same thing without looking at the menu. You confirmed the hemothorax before imaging, Rourke said. Not a question. She'd read the chart. I had maybe 4 minutes, Mara said. I went clinical. You went fast. The paramedics said the patient would have arrested within 15 minutes without the chest tube. Probably less. Rourke looked at her in the way people sometimes did when they were recalibrating. You've done this before, not nursing. I was a combat medic, Army, 3 deployments. I know. Rourke turned her coffee cup once in its saucer. Staff Sergeant Mara Calloway, 82nd Airborne, attached to a classified recovery unit for your 2nd and 3rd tours. You were recommended for a Distinguished Service Medal that was buried in a classification review. You left the service 8 years ago under circumstances that were also buried. The coffee was hot and too bitter and exactly what she needed. Mara drank it. You did your homework. I do that. Rourke slid a folder across the table. It's thin, no label on the outside. The man you stabilized last night. His name is Marcus Webb. He's a federal intelligence asset who's been embedded in an operation we've been running for 18 months. Last night he was supposed to make contact with our agents at the truck stop. Instead, he took 3 rounds. Mara looked at the folder but didn't open it. Someone knew he was going to be there, she said. That's what concerns us. Rourke's voice stayed level, but something behind her eyes shifted slightly. And Sergeant Mercer's response, arriving at the hospital within 8 minutes of the ambulance, demanding access to the patient, filing a complaint against the one nurse who refused to let him near the patient. You think he was trying to get to Webb? I think someone was. Rourke finally picked up her coffee. What I think happened last night, Ms. Calloway, is that a man with a badge tried to remove a federal asset from medical care before we could secure him, and the only thing that stopped him was a nurse who didn't back down. Outside, a truck rumbled past on 4th Street. The diner's windows fogged slightly at the corners. Mara set her cup down. What do you need from me? Right now, a statement. Every detail of last night from the moment that gurney came through the doors. What Mercer said. What he did. What you observed about the patient. Anything unusual. Anything he said or did that seemed out of place. He was barely conscious. People say things when they're barely conscious. Rourke slid a legal pad across the table. Old school. Paper. Pen. No recordings. No digital trail. Mara noticed that too. Take your time. Mara picked up the pen. She thought back to 11:47 p.m., to the gurney coming through the doors, to the particular quality of chaos that she'd moved through like it was weather she was used to. She thought about the patient's hands, the scar on his forearm, the way he'd looked at her in those few seconds of lucidity before the shock took over. She'd thought he was trying to tell her something. Maybe he was. She started writing. She was 4 paragraphs in when her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it. Desmond, text message. Call me when you can. Something's happening at the hospital. Then 2 minutes later, federal vehicles in the parking lot. Multiple. Mara, what is going on? She looked up at Agent Rourke. Rourke's phone was already in her hand, her jaw slightly set. Her eyes moving toward the diner window with the careful attention of someone who had just received information that changed the timeline. We need to go, Rourke said. What happened? Webb's awake. She was already pulling on her jacket. Mara capped the pen, slid out of the booth, left $20 on the table without counting it, and followed her out the door into the cold Montana morning. The black SUVs were already on 4th Street, moving north toward Cascade Valley Medical Center, and the sky above Harker had gone from pale gray to the white of a sky, trying to decide whether to snow. Mara got into the passenger seat of Rourke's vehicle. 3 blocks from the hospital, she saw the first military vehicle. Not police, not FBI. Army green, no civilian markings, moving with the kind of deliberate, unhurried speed that meant it didn't need sirens to be taken seriously. Then another. Then a third. Rourke said nothing. Her hands were steady on the wheel. Mara looked at the vehicles and felt something shift in her chest. Not fear, not quite. The particular alertness of someone who recognized the shape of a situation closing in on itself. The way a tactical environment could go from manageable to critical between one breath and the next. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a number she didn't recognize. Area code she knew, though. Fort Harrison, Montana. She answered. The voice on the other end was male, precise, and spoke with the compressed efficiency of someone who didn't have time to repeat himself. Is this former Staff Sergeant Calloway? Her hand tightened slightly on the phone. It is, she said. We need you inside that hospital, the voice said. Right now. Use the east entrance. Do not stop. The call ended. Rourke pulled into the hospital parking lot, and Mara saw that the east entrance was already flanked by 2 soldiers in full kit, weapons down but present, faces forward. She reached for the door handle. Her heartbeat was even. Her breathing was even. Whatever was happening inside Cascade Valley Medical Center was not over. It was, she realized, watching a 3rd military vehicle pull into the lot with its lights cutting through the white Montana morning, only just beginning. She moved fast. The east entrance was a pair of glass doors that hospital staff used for equipment deliveries and shift changes, set back from the main parking lot behind a concrete overhang. Mara came through them at something between a walk and a run, controlled, deliberate, and the two soldiers on either side didn't stop her. One of them, young, maybe 22, looked at her badge clip out of habit before catching himself. She didn't have her badge. She'd left it at the nurse's station when they walked her out. "Calloway?" the soldier said. "Yes." "East corridor, third door on the left. Colonel Marsh is waiting." She went. The East corridor was one of the hospital's less-traveled arteries. Supply rooms, a linen closet, the door to the old records annex that hadn't been fully digitized yet. The fluorescent light above the second door was flickering, had been flickering for 3 weeks, and maintenance kept putting the work order in the same pile as everything else. Under normal circumstances, the corridor smelled like industrial cleaner and old cardboard. Right now it smelled like people who'd been up all night and were running on something harder than caffeine. There were 4 of them in the room, a converted consultation space that someone had pushed the chairs to the walls in, a table now covered with a laptop, 2 phones, a printed map of the hospital floor plan, and a radio unit that was the kind of equipment you didn't buy at a civilian store. 3 of the 4 were in uniform. The 4th was a woman in her early 50s in civilian clothes, hair pulled back, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead like she'd forgotten they were there. The man at the center of the table was Colonel Marsh. She knew the rank from the insignia before he spoke. He was compact, gray-haired, with a face that had the particular weathered look of someone who'd spent significant portions of their career outside and in weather that wasn't optional. He looked at her when she came through the door, the way officers looked at people they'd already been briefed on, assessing the gap between the file and the reality. "Nurse Calloway." He didn't extend his hand. Neither did she. "You called," she said. "Sit down." "I'd rather stand." Something crossed his face. Not irritation, more like confirmation of something he'd expected. He pulled out the chair across from him and sat himself, which was as close to a concession as she suspected he made. "Marcus Webb," he said. "How lucid was he when you were working on him?" "His GCS was 12 when he came in. Dropped to 9 by the time we had the chest tube in. He had maybe 90 seconds of partial responsiveness." She crossed her arms, then made herself stop. Defensive posture. And she wasn't defensive. She was tired and sharp and needed to be neither right now. She let her arms drop. "He didn't say anything I could make out. He looked at me. He looked at you. Like he recognized me. Or recognized something about me." She paused. "I've never met Marcus Webb." Colonel Marsh glanced at the woman with the reading glasses, who had been watching Mara with the focused quiet of someone who processed information faster than they showed. The woman gave a small nod that meant something between them. "You have a file," Marsh said. "Army, part of it's accessible, part of it isn't." "I know what's in my file." "Then you know you were attached to an extraction unit for 2 of your 3 tours, and you know that unit was involved in a series of operations that required significant discretion." "I know what I did." Her voice stayed flat. "I also know I was a medic. I kept people alive. Whatever the operation was, I was the one making sure someone came home breathing." "One of those someones," Marsh said, "was Marcus Webb." The room was quiet for a moment. Not dramatically, not with any particular weight, just the factual silence of a piece of information landing in the place it needed to go. Mara looked at him. "When?" "Coast Province, 2017. You evacuated 2 members of his team under fire after their vehicle was disabled. Webb was hit, lost significant blood, and you made a field decision that his attending physician later said saved his life by about 8 minutes. Marsh folded his hands on the table. "He requested you, Calloway, when he was coming around this morning. First coherent thing out of his mouth was your name." She didn't say anything for a moment. She was thinking about 2017, not the operation. She couldn't fully reconstruct it. They blurred, but the feeling of it. The particular quality of those 8 minutes, the vehicle, the sand, the specific weight of a decision made with incomplete information and insufficient time. "Why was he at that truck stop?" she asked. "He was meeting a courier. Someone was supposed to hand him a physical file, documents that would have confirmed a corruption network that's been operating inside local law enforcement in 3 Montana counties for approximately 2 years. Marsh's voice was steady and uninflected, the kind of steady that came from practice. "Someone knew the meet was happening. Webb was shot before the courier arrived." And Mercer was on duty last night, said the woman with the reading glasses, speaking for the first time. Her voice was lower than Mara expected, slightly hoarse. He had no call to be at Cascade Valley. The shooting was outside his jurisdiction. He came anyway, and he arrived. She pulled a printed page from the stack near the laptop. 11 minutes after the first ambulance was dispatched, before any hospital notification went out through public channels. He knew Webb was being brought here, Mara said. We believe so. Then someone told him. That's the question. The woman set the paper down. My name is Dr. Linda Farr. I'm a federal forensic analyst attached to the FBI task force Agent Rourke runs. And what I'm looking at right now is a timeline that has some very uncomfortable holes in it, including the question of how a local police sergeant knew the destination of a federal assets ambulance before the hospital did. Mara stood in that room and let all of it settle. She wasn't shocked. She'd moved in environments where information had more value than weapons, where the shape of a situation could shift completely based on who knew what and when. But she was aware of something hardening in her, some part of herself that had been patient for the last 6 hours and was now done being patient. He's shoved me into a supply cart, she said, in front of witnesses, and the hospital suspended me. We know, Marsh said. Hospital administration got a call, Farr said more carefully. We're looking at who made it and from where. So while I was being walked out of my own ER, someone was running interference. Yes. She took a breath. What do you need from me? Right now, we need you to stay in this building. Marsh stood. He was slightly shorter than she was and didn't seem to care. Webb is in the ICU. He's stable. He's asking for you, and having you visible is... He searched for the word. Useful. You're a known quantity to him. He'll talk more freely. I'm on administrative leave. You're reinstated as of 6 this morning, Marsh said. I made a call. Administration agreed. Did they agree or were they told? The faintest thing moved across his face. Both. She almost said something else. Didn't. All right, she said. Take me to him. Marcus Webb didn't look like someone who'd taken 3 bullets 12 hours ago. He looked like someone who'd taken 3 bullets 12 hours ago and was furious about it, which was different. He was propped up at a 45-degree angle in the ICU bed, pale and tight-jawed, a chest tube still in place, and monitors tracking him with the dedication of things that didn't take breaks. His left arm was immobilized. His right hand was lying flat on the blanket, fingers slightly spread, and even in that position, there was a controlled quality to him, like his body was conserving something. He looked at her when she came in and said, I thought you'd be taller. I thought you'd be more grateful, she said. Something like a smile moved across his face and then winced away because smiling pulled something that wasn't ready to be pulled. Sit down. I'm fine standing. I know you're fine standing. I'm asking anyway. He shifted slightly, jaw tight. Takes me back to not being the one who gets to be upright. Humor me. She pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat. Behind her, she was aware of Marsh and Farr positioning themselves outside the room's glass partition, giving them the appearance of privacy without the reality of it. You said my name, she said, when you were coming around. I knew you were there, in the trauma bay. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. There's a point where you're not quite out, but you can't move. I could hear you working, heard you push back on... He stopped. Mercer, what do you know about him? As of this morning, more than I did. She looked at Webb directly. What do you know? His name came up 6 weeks ago, Webb said. His voice was measured. Not weak, he was keeping it controlled on purpose. In connection with a property transaction that shouldn't have gone through. A piece of land in Cutter County that got rezoned quietly, with signatures from 3 officials who should have refused. One of them is dead. Heart attack, ruled natural. The other 2 won't return calls. He paused. Mercer's name wasn't on any paperwork. It never is. That's the thing about people like him. They stay 1 signature away. But he knew about the meat. Somebody told him, which means the leak is closer than we thought. He turned his head to look at her. The movement clearly cost him something. The courier. The one I was supposed to meet at the truck stop. Did anyone? I don't know, she said. I've been out of the loop. Find out. His voice had an edge to it that she recognized. Not command exactly, more like urgency wearing command's clothing. If the courier was intercepted, the door opened. Not Marsh, not far. Dr. Ansel Priya stepped in, chart in hand, and stopped when he saw Mara. "You're back," he said. His voice had something in it she couldn't immediately categorize, not unfriendly, but careful. "Apparently," he looked at Webb. "I need to check the drain. 2 minutes." She stood, moved to the window, and watched Priya work. He was good. She'd always thought he was good, faster hands than his manner suggested, attentive to the patient's face in the way that distinguished real clinicians from technically proficient ones. He murmured something to Webb she couldn't hear, and Webb answered in a few words. When Priya finished and moved to the door, he paused beside her. "Mercer is still in the building," he said quietly. Not whispering. Quiet, the difference mattered. "He came back about 40 minutes ago. He's in the administrative wing with the hospital director." She looked at him. "Why are you telling me?" He looked at the floor, then up. "Because last night after they walked you out, I went back to that bay, and there was a nurse in there, not one of ours. I didn't recognize her. Going through the patient's chart. She left when she saw me. I logged it. But I don't know if anyone—" "What did she look like?" He described a woman she didn't recognize. 40s, short dark hair, scrub top that was slightly wrong. The color of Cascade Valley's scrubs, but the cut of a different hospital's brand. "Did you report it to anyone besides the log?" "I told the charge nurse." "Desmond?" "He said he'd look into it." Priya paused. "I haven't heard anything since." She nodded once, slowly. "Thank you." He left. She stood at the window and thought about a woman in wrong scrubs in a trauma bay going through a federal assets chart at 1 in the morning. She went back to Webb. "The chart," she said. "Someone accessed your chart last night after I left." His expression didn't change much, but something tightened around his eyes. "What chart?" "Your medical chart. Unauthorized. Priya saw a woman in the bay. They're looking for the intake notation." "What notation?" "When you documented the scar on my left forearm." He looked at her steadily. "You would have noted it in the physical assessment. Standard practice." She remembered. She'd noted it. Healed surgical scar, approximately 8 centimeters, left forearm, consistent with prior procedure. Unremarkable in a standard patient. She'd flagged it only because it was the kind of clean that wasn't accidental. "Why does that matter?" "Because the scar is a marker," Webb said. "Specifically placed during a procedure 18 months ago. Military medical records only. If someone knows what it means, it confirms who I am. If that chart gets out of this building, it already might have." She kept her voice level. "If they accessed it last night before federal security was in place, then we have a window problem." His right hand tightened on the blanket. "They'd know exactly who to tell." She was already moving to the door. Farr needed to know. Marsh needed to know. And she needed to find Desmond and find out whether he'd actually followed up on Priya's report, or whether that report had gone somewhere it shouldn't have. She found Desmond in the break room off the nurse's station, sitting with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking, staring at the wall. He looked like a man who'd been awake for 22 hours and had recently been told something he wasn't sure how to carry. "Des." He looked up. His expression when he saw her was complicated. Relief, guilt, something that was trying to be apology and not quite getting there. "You're back." "Priya said he reported something to you last night. A woman in Bay 4. He looked at his coffee. "He did." "What did you do with it?" "I logged it. I was going to—" He stopped. Started again. "I was going to escalate it in the morning when administration was back. It was 3 in the morning, Mara. I had 2 patients in the waiting room who'd been there since 8 p.m. and Did you tell anyone else?" "I told Reyes. She was covering the bay." He looked up. "And I got a call around 3:30. "From who?" "From the director's assistant, saying that there had been a law enforcement follow-up authorized by the hospital, and that any documentation related to the John Doe in Bay 4 should be held pending review." He paused. "She said not to process any chart activity reports until further notice." The silence in the break room was a specific kind of silence. Mara was aware of the refrigerator humming, a chair scraping somewhere down the hall, the sound of the building doing what buildings did while people inside them made choices that couldn't be unmade. Did the director's assistant say who authorized that hold? She said it came from Sergeant Mercer's department, a formal law enforcement hold request. Desmond, she kept her voice even, a law enforcement hold on medical records requires a court order or a federal warrant. A sergeant can't just call and freeze chart activity. He looked at his coffee again. I know. Did you know that last night? The pause was long enough to answer itself. She didn't push it. Desmond was a good nurse and a decent man, and last night he'd been exhausted and presented with something that looked official enough to comply with, and she understood how that happened. She also understood that it meant the chart access had been suppressed. Nobody had reviewed it, nobody had flagged it, and whatever the woman in the wrong scrubs had done in Bay 4 had sat quietly in an unreviewed log for 6 hours. Come with me, she said. Where? You're going to tell Agent Rourke everything you just told me. He stood without arguing, which meant he already knew he should have escalated it differently. They found Rourke in the corridor outside the administrative wing, on her phone, moving back and forth in the particular three-step pattern of someone who needed to pace but didn't have the space for it. She held up a finger when she saw them, finished the call, and looked at Mara with an expression that said something had already shifted in the last 20 minutes. Mercer's in with the director, Rourke said. He brought his department's legal counsel. They're claiming the federal presence here violates a local jurisdictional agreement, and they want Webb transferred to county custody pending. That's not going to happen, Mara said. No, it's not. But they're stalling. Rourke's jaw was tight. And I don't know why stalling is useful to them, unless they're waiting for something. They're waiting to find out if the chart got out. Mara looked at Desmond. Tell her, Desmond told her. All of it. The unauthorized access report, the phone call from the director's assistant, the hold-on chart documentation. Rourke listened without interrupting, and her face went through several things it didn't fully show. When he was done, she said, Who else knows about this hold? Whoever the director's assistant called. Whoever she was told to call by. I need to know what's on that original chart access log. Rourke looked at Mara. Is there a way to pull it without going through the administrative system, directly from the nursing station records? The ICU nurses station keeps a parallel access log, Mara said. It's a backup system. Old. Nobody really uses it because the main system is faster. But it would have captured the access if the equipment in Bay 4 was active. Can you get to it? I'm technically reinstated. Rourke looked at her for one long second. Do it. The ICU nursing station was 3 corridors away, and Mara moved through them with Desmond half a step behind and her mind already on the parallel log system, a relic from a 2008 infrastructure update that the hospital had never fully decommissioned because the grant that funded it had required 5 years of parallel operation, and by the time the 5 years were up, nobody had been motivated to disconnect a system that worked. It ran on a separate server, separate access credentials, and it was the kind of thing only people who'd been at Cascade Valley for more than 6 years knew existed. Mara had been at Cascade Valley for 7 years. She sat at the station terminal, entered her credentials, navigated 3 menus that nobody had redesigned since the Obama administration, and found the Bay 4 access log for the period between 1:15 and 3 a.m. 3 access events. 2 of them were Priya and the night shift pharmacist confirming medication records. Standard, time-stamped, legitimate. The 3rd was at 1:54 a.m. Duration, 11 minutes. Credential used, a floating staff ID that was assigned to temporary personnel, the kind of ID that got handed out when an agency nurse or locum physician came in for a single shift and needed system access. She pulled the credential ID and ran it back through the system. The ID had been issued 6 days ago, assigned to a nurse named Petra Hollins, working a contracted shift that had ended at midnight. A nurse who should have been gone from the building 2 hours before the access occurred. Mara, Desmond's voice low. She looked up. Through the glass partition of the ICU, she could see Webb's room. Marsh was inside it now, standing at the foot of the bed, his posture communicating something urgent. Webb had his hand up, not waving someone off, gesturing, explaining. His face was different from when she'd left him, not in pain, angry. She was already moving. She pushed through the ICU doors, and Marsh glanced at her as she entered, and the thing on his face was the particular expression of a man who had just received information that made a bad situation worse. "What happened?" she said. "The courier," Webb said. His voice was flat and controlled, and underneath it was something she recognized as the specific fury of someone who'd calculated the human cost of a failure. "They got to her." "Is she alive?" "She's in a hospital in Billings. She was run off the road 2 hours before the meeting." He looked at the ceiling. "She had the file on her, hard copies, digital copies on an encrypted drive." He paused. "The drive is missing." The room was quiet except for the monitors. "So whatever was on it," Mara said. "They have it." Webb closed his eyes, opened them. Or someone does. Which means 18 months of work, 6 sources, and a corruption network in 3 counties that was 12 days away from a federal indictment. He stopped. "It's not over," Marsh said. "There are copies. There are partial copies." Webb's jaw tightened. The file on that drive had the full chain. The land transactions, the money movement, the names at every level. Without it, he made a small, controlled gesture with his right hand that meant the architecture collapses. Mara stood and thought about the woman in the wrong scrubs. 11 minutes of chart access, a credential that should have been gone from the system. "The chart notation," she said. "If they confirmed your identity from the chart, they knew who you were by 2 in the morning, but the shooting happened at 11:47, so they already knew who you were before the hospital." Webb looked at her. "They weren't confirming," she said. "They were verifying, making sure you hadn't switched out, that it was actually you and not a decoy." She was thinking out loud now, the way she thought in the field when the map and the terrain didn't match, and you had to find the discrepancy before it found you. Someone sent that woman into the bay not to get information, but to confirm they had the right person. "Which means," Farr said from the doorway, she'd come in silent, how long she'd been there wasn't clear, "that whatever they did next, they did knowing for certain who they had." "The file," Webb said. "If they confirmed your identity and they had the file from the courier," Mara said, "what else would they need?" Nobody answered immediately. The monitors beeped. Outside the glass partition, the ICU moved in its quiet, functional way. Nurses checking on other patients, a cart rolling past, ordinary medicine happening around an extraordinary problem. "Webb," she looked at him. "What's not on the file? What's in your head that isn't anywhere else?" He looked at her for a long time. "The 4th county," he said. "The operation only covers 3 counties." The documented operation. He shifted in the bed, and it cost him. "There's a 4th. I found it 8 weeks ago. It's not in any report. I hadn't fully confirmed it. I was going to put it in the file at the meet, handwritten, to keep it off digital." He paused. "If they got the drive and it's not on there, they don't know you know." "Not yet." He looked at Marsh. "But if they know I'm alive and they know I'm talking..." Mara heard it before she processed it. A shift in the sound of the corridor outside the ICU. The particular change of ambient noise that happened when a group of people moved with purpose down a hospital hall. She turned to the glass partition. Sergeant Boyd Mercer was walking toward the ICU with 2 of his officers and a man in a suit who had the smooth, aggrieved expression of a lawyer who believed he was about to win something. Behind her, Webb said quietly, "He can't come in here." She watched Mercer stop at the ICU entrance, watched him produce something, a document, a paper, holding it up for the nurse's station. Watched him speak to the nurse behind the desk with the particular posture of someone who had decided authority was something you demonstrated by making other people uncomfortable. The nurse at the desk looked at the paper, looked up, looked toward Webb's room, looked directly at Mara. Mara held her gaze for a moment. Then she turned to Marsh. "Whatever that document is," she said, "we have maybe 90 seconds. Marsh was already on his radio. And from the direction of the main hospital entrance, she felt almost the way you felt low frequencies before you heard them. The sound of boots on linoleum, multiple pairs, moving fast. At the nurse's station, the nurse was still holding Mercer's document, still looking uncertain. Mercer leaned forward and said something, and whatever he said made her reach for the ICU door release. Mara stepped out of Webb's room and into the corridor, positioning herself between the ICU door and the nurse's station, and she looked at Mercer across 12 feet of hospital corridor, and Mercer looked back at her. Something moved across his face when he recognized her. Not surprise. Calculation. Fast, the way practiced minds calculated. "Nurse Calloway," he said. His voice was smooth. "I thought you were on leave. I thought you were in the administrative wing. I go where the investigation takes me." He held up the document. She could see it now, the letterhead, something from the county prosecutor's office. "I have a court authorization to take custody of the patient in room 4 for questioning related to the shooting on Route 9. This is a lawful—" "That man is in federal protective custody," she said. "That has not been formally established with the county court. Then formally establishing it should take about 4 minutes. She didn't move from where she was standing. So I'd wait, if I were you." Mercer took a step forward. His lawyer put a hand on his arm, a gesture that meant not yet in a language that was apparently universal. "You're obstructing again," Mercer said. "I'm standing in a corridor." She kept her hands loose at her sides. "Both of us have the right to do that." Behind Mercer, at the far end of the corridor, the first soldier appeared, then a second, moving with the unhurried speed that said they didn't need to run because they'd already won the geometry of the situation. Mercer heard the boots. He turned, and on his face, for the first time, was something that wasn't calculation. The lawyer was already speaking quietly into his phone. Mara watched Mercer's hand drop to his belt, not his weapon, a reflex, and then move away. She watched him turn back to her. She watched him understand in real time that the piece of paper in his hand was not going to do what he'd brought it here to do. "This isn't over," he said. She looked at him with the particular steadiness of someone who has been through things that make a hospital corridor feel very manageable. "No," she said, "it's not." The soldiers reached them. The lead officer, a first lieutenant, she read the insignia without thinking about it, addressed Mercer's lawyer directly, in the clipped, precise language of someone reading from a clear legal authority, and the hallway became the kind of controlled chaos that looked like stillness until you noticed how many people had a hand near something. Mercer stood in the middle of it, and then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something crossed his face that she hadn't seen on it yet. Not anger, not calculation. Something closer to fear, and he was trying hard not to let it be visible, and she could see that he wasn't entirely succeeding. He answered the call. Listened for 5 seconds. His face went incrementally, the specific shade of a man who has just been told the thing he believed was contained is no longer contained. He lowered the phone. He looked at Mara. She looked back at him. The fluorescent light at the end of the corridor hummed. Somewhere behind her, deeper in the ICU, a monitor alarm sounded. Not Webb's room, another patient, the routine emergency that kept happening while everything else did. And she heard footsteps, a nurse moving, the sound of a crisis being handled the way crises got handled in places where people showed up every day to handle them. Mercer said nothing. He put his phone back in his pocket, and his hand was not entirely steady when he did it. The call had lasted 5 seconds. Mara had counted without meaning to. Old habit, the kind that lived in the body rather than the mind. 5 seconds, and whatever Mercer heard in those 5 seconds had done something to him that 12 hours of maneuvering, legal documents, and institutional pressure hadn't managed to do. It had made him uncertain. She filed that away. The lieutenant was still speaking to the lawyer, walking him through the federal custody documentation with the patient efficiency of someone who'd done this before and didn't need the other person's agreement to proceed. Mercer's 2 officers had drifted slightly, not retreating, but no longer advancing, the subtle physical language of people waiting to see which way the wind settled. Mercer himself hadn't moved. He was standing in the corridor with his phone in his pocket and his face doing the work of staying composed while something underneath it wasn't. "Sergeant," the lieutenant addressed him directly now, "your county order doesn't supersede the federal hold. You're welcome to contact the U.S. Attorney's Office if you want to contest that. The number's on the documentation." He held out a copy. Mercer didn't take it. The lieutenant set it on the nurse's counter. In the meantime, I need you and your officers to clear the ICU corridor. A beat. 2. We'll be in touch, the lawyer said smoothly, filling the silence his client had left. He touched Mercer's arm again. Move. And this time Mercer moved. He walked past Mara close enough that she could hear the creak of his jacket again. He didn't look at her. That was new. Every other interaction he'd looked at her, assessed her, dismissed her, tried to put her in a category that made her manageable. Now he was looking at the middle distance, and his jaw was tight in the specific way of someone processing something they hadn't planned for. At the end of the corridor, before he turned the corner, he glanced back. Not at her. At Webb's room. Then he was gone. Mara exhaled through her nose and turned back to the ICU. Webb's monitor alarm had resolved. The nurse had handled it. Different patient, no crisis. The ICU had returned to its baseline rhythm, that particular sustained tension of a place where the margin between stable and not stable was measured in minutes, and the people working there had learned to function in the space between. Farr was at her shoulder. The phone call, Mara said. We're working on it. Farr's voice was tight. We have a tap request in, but he was told something specific, something that scared him. That's not information you get from a lawyer or a bureaucratic delay. She looked at Farr. Someone on his side of this is cutting him loose. Farr looked at her steadily. What makes you say that? Because the call came to him, not from him. She moved toward Webb's room. Someone reached out, in the middle of a standoff. That's not legal strategy. That's somebody covering their own exposure and warning him he's exposed. She pushed through the door. Marsh was still in the room, standing now with his arms crossed, watching Webb. The way you watch someone you were responsible for and weren't sure you could protect from everything you needed to protect them from. Webb looked at Mara when she came in. He left. For now. What was the call? We don't know yet. She moved to the side of the bed. Webb's color was slightly better than an hour ago. Not good, but functional, the body beginning the slow, grinding work of compensating for what it had lost. His right hand was still flat on the blanket. His left arm was immobilized. He looked like a man who was aware, at every moment, that he couldn't move fast enough to matter right now, and had made a decision not to spend energy resenting it. Webb, the 4th County, I need everything you have. I have it in my head. Then let's get it out of your head and into something that can't be taken from you. She looked at Marsh. I need paper, actual paper, and I need someone positioned outside this room who isn't in a uniform, because the next move they make is going to be quieter than the last one. Marsh reached for his radio without questioning her. She pulled the chair back to the bedside and Webb began talking, low and steady, the way people talked when they'd been trained to transmit information efficiently, and every sentence had weight. The 4th County was Barrow, smaller than the other 3, further north, less population, which was exactly why it had been useful. The rezoning there had happened 18 months ago, before the operation even identified the pattern. A parcel of federal land had been reclassified through a state administrative process that should have taken 2 years and took 11 weeks. The money that moved through it didn't look like corruption. It looked like investment. A series of development companies with clean registration, clean principles, no obvious flags. Except that 2 of those companies shared a registered agent, and that registered agent had a professional history that connected, through 3 degrees of separation and 1 name change, to a man named Raymond Curl, who was the current director of the Barrow County Administrative Office and had been, 20 years ago, a business partner of the man who now ran the Harker Police Department's Civilian Oversight Board. The Oversight Board, Mara said. The people who review complaints against officers, Webb said. The people who would review a complaint filed against, for example, a sergeant who assaulted a nurse in an emergency room. She sat with that for a moment. The architecture of it wasn't elegant. Real corruption never was. It was accumulated, patched, held together with relationships and silence, and the particular gravity of people who needed each other's continued cooperation. But it was load-bearing. Remove one piece, and the rest became visible. Mercer's not the top, she said. Mercer's middle management, Webb said. He's useful because he has access, and he doesn't ask about the things above him. He gets paid in protection. His complaints go away, his promotions clear, his record stays clean. He shifted carefully. But if someone above him thinks he's a liability, his monitor spiked, not alarmingly, a run of tachycardia, 8 seconds, then resolved. His jaw tightened. "You need to stop talking," she said. "I need to finish. You need your heart rate under 90, or Dr. Priya is going to have opinions about this conversation." She looked at the monitor, then at him. "Who's at the top?" He told her a name. She knew the name. Everyone in Harker knew the name. It was on a building, on a civic center, on a scholarship fund that had been running for 15 years and contributed to the college funds of a significant percentage of Harker's municipal employees. She sat with it in a way that wasn't surprise exactly, more like recognition, the specific feeling of a piece sliding into a space that had been waiting for it. "Does Rourke know?" she asked. "She knows the edges. She doesn't have the connection to Barrow." He looked at her. "That's why the file mattered. It had the paper trail. And the drive is gone." "The drive is gone." She stood. The chair scraped back. "What did you tell me that isn't anywhere else?" "All of it." He said it without drama. Barrow County, the registered agent, Curl, the connection to the oversight board. He paused. "The name. Then it's not gone." She moved to the door. "It's here." She found Farr in the corridor and started talking before Farr could say anything. Farr listened with her reading glasses still pushed up on her forehead, and her expression did the thing it did when information was reorganizing itself into a new shape in real time. "Curl," Farr said when Mara finished. "You know him?" "We have him in a peripheral role. We didn't have the registered agent connection." Farr pulled her phone out. "If that holds up, Webb can testify to his investigative process. The connection is documentable even without the drive. The corporate registrations are public record. The agent's name change is court recorded." Mara kept her voice low and even. "You can reconstruct the paper trail. It takes longer, but it's there. We'd need Webb on the record, formally." Farr was already dialing. "And we'd need to move on Curl before Mercer's call reaches him, if that's who Mercer was warned by. It's not Curl who called him." Farr stopped dialing, looked at her. "Curl isn't the kind of person who makes that call himself," Mara said. 5 seconds. No preamble, no explanation, just information that landed. That's someone Mercer trusts completely. One person. She thought about it. Someone in his own department. Farr's face went very still. "His lieutenant," Mara said. "Or his captain. Someone who knew about the federal hold the same time Mercer did, because they were watching the same situation from the inside, and when they saw it tip, they called him to say it was time to stop pushing." Farr put the phone to her ear. When someone answered, she said 3 words that Mara didn't fully catch, and then moved away down the corridor with the rapid, purposeful stride of someone who was not done working. Mara stood in the ICU corridor. Down the hall, a family was gathered outside a room. 3 adults, 1 teenager, the specific posture of people in a waiting state, beyond anxiety and into the suspended exhaustion that came after hours of not knowing. A nurse was speaking to them, quietly. Mara watched without watching, the way you took in peripheral information in environments where peripheral information sometimes mattered. Her phone buzzed. "Desmond, camera footage from last night. Someone pulled the Bay 4 security archive. It's gone." She typed back, "When was it pulled?" His response took 40 seconds. Timestamp shows 4:17 a.m. Access credential was admin level, director's login. She stared at that for a moment. The director of Cascade Valley Medical Center had accessed the security archive at 4:17 in the morning and deleted footage from the trauma bay where a federal asset had been treated, hours after that asset's chart had been accessed by someone who shouldn't have been in the building. She called Rourke. Rourke picked up on the first ring. "I know," she said. "You know about the footage?" "We just pulled the server log. It's been flagged." A pause. And in the pause, Mara could hear the sound of movement, vehicles, something that wasn't inside a building. "Where are you?" "ICU corridor." "Stay there." Rourke's voice had changed, not louder but denser, the compression of someone managing several simultaneous things. "We're executing a search of the administrative offices in—" She stopped. "Mara, does Marsh know where you are?" "He's in Webb's room." Get back in that room. What's now? The call ended. She was through the ICU door in 4 steps. Marsh looked up when she came in, reading her face, and his hand moved to his radio before she said anything. Rourke says stay in the room, she said. Webb's eyes tracked between them. What's in the administrative wing? Marsh said. Not to her. Into the radio. The response was clipped, broken slightly by the building's interference, but she caught enough of it. 3 words, and then static, and then a 4th word that made Marsh turn to the door with an expression she hadn't seen on his face yet. She caught the last word clearly. Weapon. The ICU's lights were steady. The monitors beeped. Somewhere in the building, in the administrative wing where federal agents were executing a search, something had shifted in a direction nobody had planned for, and the specific sound of a hospital under controlled emergency, different from the medical kind, sharper, with a human quality that vital signs machines didn't produce, had begun to move through the corridors toward them. Webb had heard the radio. He looked at Mara. She looked at the door. Through the glass partition of the ICU, at the end of the corridor, a figure appeared. Not running, not uniformed, moving with the careful, deliberate speed of someone who knew where they were going and had calculated they still had time. It was the hospital director, Gerald Voss, 58 years old, 22 years at Cascade Valley, whose name was on the scholarship fund and the civic center and the administrative hold that had buried Priya's report and the 4:17 a.m. deletion of a federal asset security footage. He was moving toward the ICU. He was alone, and his right hand at his side was not empty. Mara moved before she'd made the decision to move. It wasn't bravery. She'd been in enough situations to know that bravery was mostly a story people told afterward to make sense of what was actually just trained reaction time. She stepped to the left of the ICU door, putting herself out of the direct sightline of the glass partition, and turned to Marsh. Radio, she said. Quiet, flat. He was already on it. The response came back fragmented, the building's concrete and steel doing what it always did to signals, but she caught corridor and contained and the absence of secure, which told her what she needed to know. The administrative wing hadn't been fully locked down. Voss had gotten out. He's got 30 seconds before he hits the ICU entrance, she said. Webb had pushed himself slightly upright. His face was wrong. Too much effort, too little resource. But his eyes were tracking everything. How many soldiers outside? 2 on the east entrance. The lieutenant was in the corridor. Marsh spoke into the radio again, got a clipped response. Lieutenant Harker is moving from the east wing, 90 seconds. That's a long 90 seconds, Mara said. She looked through the partition. Voss was still moving, still alone, still that same deliberate, unhurried pace that was its own kind of terrible. Not the pace of panic, but of calculation. A man who had decided something and was seeing it through. His right hand was partially concealed against his thigh. Is that a gun? Webb asked. I can't tell from here. If it's a gun, he's not going to make it 10 feet past the ICU door before, if it's not a gun, nobody stops him at the door. She looked at Marsh. Does he have clearance to be in this unit? He's the hospital director. He has clearance everywhere. Then legally, he can walk in here, not into a room with a federal witness under protection. He doesn't have to come into the room. She moved to the room's supply cabinet. ICU rooms kept certain equipment close, and she'd worked this floor enough years to know the layout without looking. She was thinking practically, the way she thought in the field when the situation contracted and options narrowed and you worked with what was in your hands. He just has to cause enough disruption to... The ICU entrance door opened. Voss came through it with the smooth familiarity of a man who'd walked through that door 1,000 times, which he had. 22 years. He knew every nurse on this floor by first name, knew which monitors ran loud and which ran quiet, knew where the supply closets were and which physicians worked which rotations. He'd built this unit's East Wing expansion with a personal fundraising campaign 11 years ago. His name was, in fact, on a plaque beside the entrance. He stopped when he saw Mara outside Webb's door. Something crossed his face. Not surprise. He'd known she'd been reinstated. He'd been told. The expression was something closer to the specific displeasure of a man who has planned for an obstacle and is annoyed to find it exactly where he expected it. Nurse Calloway. His voice was the voice of a man who ran things, measured, accustomed to being the one who set the tone. I need to speak with the patient in room 4. He's not available for visitors. I'm not a visitor. I'm the director of this hospital. He's in federal protective custody. She stayed where she was. Room 4 isn't under hospital jurisdiction right now. Voss looked at her the way people looked at someone they'd already decided they were done accounting for. He looked at Marsh. He looked at Webb through the glass. His right hand moved. It wasn't a gun. It was a phone, and the sight of it was somehow both a relief and immediately more complicated, because a phone meant he wasn't here for something final. He was here for something transactional, information, or pressure, or the particular leverage of a man who had spent 22 years building a position that he believed made him impossible to simply remove. He raised the phone. "I'm documenting this," he said. "Federal interference with hospital operations. The illegal detention of an administrator within his own facility. You're welcome to document whatever you'd like," Marsh said. His voice was the verbal equivalent of a closed door. "From the other side of the ICU entrance. This is my hospital. Right now it's a federal secure zone." Marsh didn't raise his voice. "Which you know because you were informed of that designation at 6:45 this morning when Agent Rourke briefed your legal counsel." He took one step forward, and it was the kind of step that had nothing performative about it. It was simply a reduction in distance that communicated clearly what would happen if Voss came further. "I need you to turn around." Voss didn't turn around, but something in his posture shifted, the slight reweighting of a person recalculating in real time. He looked at the phone in his hand. He looked at Mara. "You think you've won something," he said. Not to Marsh, to her. She didn't answer that because it wasn't a real question. It was the kind of thing people said when they were buying seconds to think. "I've run this hospital for 22 years, he said. "I've protected this community. Mr. Voss." She kept her voice even. "The security footage from Bay 4, the one you deleted at 4:17 this morning." She watched his face. "It wasn't the only copy." He was still. Cascade Valley runs a third-party off-site backup for its security archive. Contractual requirement from the liability insurance carrier. 30-day rolling backup. Automatic, not accessible from the internal admin system. She hadn't known that an hour ago. She'd called the hospital's IT contractor, whose personal number she had because 6 months ago she'd helped his wife through a difficult night in the ER, and he'd given her his card out of something like gratitude. She'd called him at 7 a.m. and asked one question. "The footage is intact." Voss's jaw moved. "That's not—" He stopped. "It's complete," she said. "Bay 4, the full window, including the woman in the wrong scrubs at 1:54 a.m., whose temporary credential traces back to an ID request submitted through the hospital's agency staffing system, a request that came from your administrative login 6 days ago." The ICU was very quiet. "You sent her in," Mara said, "before the federal hold, before any of this. You already knew who was coming. You already knew what to look for. She let that land for exactly as long as it needed to. You've known about Marcus Webb for weeks." What happened to Voss's face was not dramatic. It wasn't a collapse or a confession or anything that would look good in the kind of story where people broke under pressure in obvious ways. It was something smaller and in some ways worse. The specific deflation of a man who had been holding something rigid inside himself and had just felt it give way. His shoulders didn't drop, his chin didn't fall, but something behind his eyes went out, like a pilot light that had been running so long you didn't notice it until it was gone. He looked suddenly like he was 68 instead of 58. He looked like what he was, a man who had spent 22 years building something that had stopped being about the hospital a long time ago, and who had just understood that the version of this where he walked away intact no longer existed. The ICU entrance opened behind him. Agent Rourke came through with 2 federal agents, and she looked at Voss with the particular expression of someone who had been building toward this moment through 18 months of careful work and was not experiencing it as triumph because there was no triumph in it, just the grim completion of something that should never have needed completing. "Gerald Voss," she said, I have a warrant for your arrest." He didn't run. He didn't argue. He looked at the warrant that one of the agents held out, and he read it the way a man read a document he already knew the contents of, and he said very quietly, to nobody in particular, "I want my lawyer." "He's already been notified," Rourke said. They walked him out. Not roughly. There was no roughness needed. He went the way people went when they'd run out of moves, with a kind of mechanical compliance that was its own form of admission. Mara watched him go. Webb's voice came from behind the glass. "Calloway?" She went in. He looked like he'd been holding tension for the last 10 minutes and had now let go of it all at once, which was visibly a mistake because his color had gone off again and the monitor showed it. "You need to lie down," she said. "I am lying down." "More. Tilt this back." She adjusted the bed angle, and he let her, which meant he felt worse than he was letting on. "Don't talk for 5 minutes." "The 4th County," he said. "I told Farr everything. It's in hand. Curl? Rourke has the registered agent information. She's running it." She checked his drain. Still in position, no new output that concerned her. His pulse was high normal. 5 minutes. You can interrogate me after 5 minutes. He was quiet for almost 3 of them. Then, "The footage. You were bluffing." She looked at the monitor. "The off-site backup is real." "You called the IT contractor?" "Yes." "At 7 in the morning. He owed me one." Webb made a sound that was almost a laugh, and then immediately regretted it, because laughing when you had a chest tube was a specific category of unpleasant. He exhaled carefully. "You're not what I expected." "People keep saying that." She updated his chart on the bedside terminal. "What did you expect?" "I don't know, someone angrier." He looked at the ceiling. "After what Mercer did, after the suspension." She thought about that honestly. "I was angry," she said. "I'm still angry. It just—" She paused, looking for the word that wasn't a platitude. "It doesn't help with the next problem, and there's always a next problem." He was quiet again. Outside the glass, the ICU had returned to something like its normal rhythm, which was a testament to the people who worked in it, the ability to process an extraordinary event and return to function, because the other patients didn't stop needing care because the director had just been arrested in their corridor. Mara looked at the window. The Montana sky visible between buildings had gone fully white with the clouds that had been threatening since morning, and the first few flakes of snow were beginning to move through the gap, unhurried, horizontal, the way snow moved when the wind had opinions about where it was going. The next several hours were the kind of hours that didn't feel like hours. They felt like a long corridor that kept producing more corridor. Rourke's team processed the administrative offices with the systematic thoroughness of people who understood that what they found in paper form was a different kind of evidence than what they found digitally. Harder to dispute, harder to recontextualize, harder to make a jury believe was a technical error. They found files. The files were physical, which told Mara something about how long this had been operating. People who'd built something before the digital era often kept their most important records the old way, not from nostalgia, but from understanding that paper didn't have metadata. Farr came to find Mara around noon, with a coffee she hadn't asked for but took anyway, and sat across from her at the break room table with the slightly compressed look of someone who'd been reading documents for 5 hours. "Curly?" she said. "Found?" "Found, documented, and currently being very cooperative with our field office in Billings, which suggests he spent the last 20 years knowing this day was theoretically possible and has a plan for it." She turned her coffee cup. "He's giving us names." "How many?" 11 confirmed so far, 3 in law enforcement, 2 in county administration, 1 state-level official whose name I can't give you yet." Farr looked at her steadily. "The oversight board. The one that handles officer misconduct complaints." "How deep?" "Deep enough that every complaint filed against Mercer in the last 8 years, there were 4, was reviewed by a board on which at least one member had a financial connection to this network." She paused. He knew his complaints would disappear. He knew because he'd been told, which means the things he did with a specific understanding that there would be no record that stuck. Mara held her coffee with both hands. It was too hot, and she drank it anyway. "Was there anything that should have stuck?" Farr looked at the table. "A complaint from 2019. A woman. He detained her during a traffic stop, held her for 40 minutes with no legal basis, and made statements that were— She paused. Documented by a bystander on a phone. She filed a formal complaint. It was reviewed and dismissed within 2 weeks. She looked up. The bystander's footage disappeared from the complaint file. The break room was quiet. She tried, Mara said. She tried. Farr nodded once. There are probably others who didn't. Mara thought about that woman. Unknown name, 2019, a traffic stop in Montana, a phone that had captured something and a system that had made that something not matter. She thought about the specific courage it took to file a formal complaint against a uniformed officer when you already understood, on some level, what happened to formal complaints. She thought about standing in a hospital corridor at 1 a.m. saying, I'm standing in a corridor. We both have the right to do that. Different scale. Same thing. What happens to him? She asked. Mercer? Farr sat back. Federal charges are being prepared. Civil rights violations, obstruction, conspiracy. The conspiracy charge is the one that connects him to the network. That's the one that carries real weight. She paused. His department has already suspended him. The chief made a statement this morning. Another pause. Short statement. Very careful language. The kind of language you use when you're not sure yet how much you personally knew. Is the chief— We're looking. Farr's voice was neutral in the practiced way of someone who had learned not to speculate out loud. We're looking at everything. The snow outside had gotten serious by mid-afternoon. Mara could see it through the break room window. Not a blizzard, but committed. The kind of Montana snow that made decisions about the rest of your day for you. The parking lot was accumulating. The black SUVs had white roofs. She went back to check on Webb. Priya had been in— The chart showed it, the updated notation on the drain and the pain management. Webb was awake, less color than morning, but more alert in the eyes, which was a reasonable trade. Marsh had been replaced by a different soldier outside the room. Shift rotation, she assumed, though she hadn't asked. You should sleep, she told Webb. You should sleep, he said. I'm not the one with 3 bullet wounds and a chest tube. I'm aware of what I have. He shifted carefully. Rourke was in earlier. She told me about the files. He was quiet for a moment. 22 years. Yes. Voss built something that looked like service. He said it without particular heat. Hospital, scholarship, civic center, all of it real. All of it also architecture. He looked at her. People like that, the thing that lets them do it for 22 years is that they never fully stop believing the good parts are true. The hospital is real. The scholarship fund is real. They use that to keep themselves coherent. Does that matter? She asked. For understanding? Yes. He looked at the ceiling. For consequences? No. She updated his chart. At the door she paused. The woman from the 2019 complaint. If she's ever identified, if there's a process for her, there will be, he said. Whatever Curl gives us, it rebuilds the case on every dismissed complaint in that oversight structure. They all get reviewed. He looked at her. All of them. She nodded. Went out. The afternoon moved. At 3:40 p.m., Rourke found her in the corridor near the nursing station and said, without preamble, Mercer's captain. His name is Dale Frick. He's been with the department 19 years. She handed Mara a photograph, printed the way Farr liked to work. A heavy-set man in his early 50s, the kind of face that was aggressively ordinary. He made the call this morning, the one Mercer got in the corridor. How do you know? Call records. Frick's personal cell to Mercer's personal cell, 47 seconds. She paused. And Frick's name appears on 3 of the Barrow County land transactions. Not prominently. One signature, a notarization, the kind of involvement you could explain away individually. She looked at the photo. But not in combination. Not with everything else. Is he in custody? He was interviewed this afternoon. He's not in custody yet. He has a lawyer who's very good at making time. Rourke folded the photograph. But Curl gave us something that connects Frick to the courier. The woman who was run off the road. There's a phone communication 2 hours before the accident. She paused. We're reconstructing. Mara looked down the corridor toward the east entrance. where the two soldiers were still in position, where the morning's chaos had happened and settled and left its marks in the particular silence that followed things that couldn't be undone. Rourke, she looked at the agent. The suspension, the way they walked me out. That's part of the civil rights complaint, Rourke said. Mercer's complaint to administration was made under false pretenses. The resulting suspension, we're looking at whether Voss facilitated it deliberately or whether he was just compliant. Does the distinction matter legally? It matters for the nature of the charge. Rourke looked at her directly. It matters to the people who decide what your reinstatement looks like, and whether this institution owes you something more formal than a phone call from a colonel at 6 in the morning. Mara absorbed that. She wasn't sure what she felt about it. There was something satisfying in the idea of formal acknowledgement, and something that resisted it too. The part of her that had spent years in environments where you did the job and the job didn't owe you anything except the chance to keep doing it. I'll figure that out later, she said. You should figure it out soon, Rourke said, because there are going to be questions. Formal interviews, depositions, possibly grand jury testimony, and you need to know what you want out of that process before someone decides for you. She was right. Mara knew she was right, and the knowing was slightly uncomfortable the way it was when someone else identified a thing you'd been avoiding. At 5:15 p.m., something happened that nobody had planned for. Desmond came and found her at the nursing station, and his face had the look of a man who had been carrying something for an hour and was relieved to put it down. He held out his phone. On the screen was a text message from a number she didn't recognize. I was in the waiting room the night the nurse got pushed. I worked nights at the grain elevator on Route 7. I had a broken hand from a machine accident. I saw everything. I didn't say anything because I was scared. I'm not scared anymore. I want to make a statement. She read it twice. Who is this? I don't know. They texted the hospital's general inquiry number. I only saw it because I was checking the system. Desmond looked at her. They said they'd been watching the news. The local station picked up the federal presence at the hospital. Ran a piece this afternoon. It's already on the news? Voss's arrest. They didn't have details. They had the county prosecutor confirming federal charges were pending and a lot of shots of black SUVs in the parking lot. He paused. And someone posted a video from last night. A patient in the waiting room. They had their phone out when Mercer came through. It's not complete, but you can see the supply cart move. You can see him. He paused again. It's been shared about 4,000 times in the last 2 hours. She sat with that for a moment. The person who'd texted, a night shift worker at a grain elevator, broken hand, sitting in a waiting room at midnight, had watched something happen and stayed quiet because staying quiet felt safer. And then, hours later, when the weight shifted, when the shape of the situation changed enough that speaking felt possible, they'd reached for a phone. Not heroic, just human. The kind of human that was easy to underestimate and harder to break than anyone thought. Forward me the contact, she said, and send it to Rourke. Desmond sent it. She looked at her phone, at the number, at the message with its slightly formal grammar and its plain statement of what had happened and what had changed. She thought about what it cost someone to send that, the calculation, the window of courage, the decision to name a thing they'd seen when naming it had previously felt like risk. She typed back, "Thank you for reaching out. Your statement matters. I'll connect you with the right person tonight." She sent it. She sat there. The nursing station around her was doing its ordinary end-of-shift things, handoffs, chart updates, the accumulation of small decisions that kept people alive through the night. Her patients from last night had moved on. The little girl had been discharged mid-morning, her mother's face in the chart photograph, a particular shade of exhausted relief. The farm accident was in surgical recovery and expected to do well. The man who'd walked into traffic twice had been transferred to psychiatric care with a follow-up plan and a social worker assigned. The work had continued. It always continued. At 6:30 p.m., Rourke called a meeting in the converted consultation room. Mara, Marsh, Farr, Priya, who had technically been on shift since 7 that morning and had not left, and 2 federal agents she hadn't been introduced to yet. Rourke spread documents on the table and spent 20 minutes laying out what they had in the clear organized way of someone who had learned that keeping collaborators informed was operationally necessary, even when it felt like a delay. The picture was more complete now. Curl had given them enough to build a charge structure against 7 individuals, with preliminary evidence touching 4 more. Voss's files had confirmed the Barrow County connection and added a financial layer that Farr described, with the controlled precision she brought to everything, as elegant in its construction and ugly in its purpose. The courier, whose name was Sandra Pike, who was in a Billings hospital with a concussion and a broken collarbone, had confirmed the contents of the drive, which she'd memorized as a contingency. She had, quietly and without anyone asking her to, prepared for the possibility that the physical document wouldn't make it. She memorized it, Priya said. He looked like he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. Selectively, Farr said, the core financial chain and the names at each node. 32 items. She can reproduce them verbatim. A pause. She's been working this operation for 14 months. She knew the risks. The room was quiet, with the particular quality of people absorbing the fact that other people had been doing very difficult things for a long time in the dark, and that the moment in which those things became visible was not a beginning but an end of something sustained and costly. What about Frick? Mara asked. Rourke looked at her. Still being processed. His lawyer is... She paused. Buying time, as I said. But Curl's communication record connecting him to the accident is strong. The phone metadata is clean. We'll have him. Tonight? Possibly tonight. Definitely by morning. Mara looked at the table, at the spread of documents, names, dates, transaction records, the accumulated paperweight of 22 years of something that had been allowed to grow in the space between accountability and enforcement. It was enormous and depressing, and also, in a very specific way, finite. It had a shape now. Shapes could be addressed. The military medical record, she said. Webb's scar marker. If whoever accessed the chart in the bay shared that information externally, we're working on containment, Marsh said. Webb's operational identity is being restructured. It's a process, not a problem. Is he safe to stay here? Safer here than anywhere he'd be moved to tonight. Marsh looked at her. You'll be in the building until morning? I'm on shift at 7 a.m. Then yes. He looked like he was about to say something further, and then didn't, and the thing he hadn't said sat in the room for a moment before he covered it with, get some rest if you can. She got 4 hours on the break room couch, which was not comfortable and was better than nothing, and was interrupted once at 2 a.m. when Webb's monitor threw an alarm that turned out to be artifact. A lead had shifted. Mara replaced it. Webb told her to go back to sleep. She went back to sleep. At 4:47 a.m., Rourke texted her. Frick is in custody. Arrested at his home at 0400. No incident. She read it in the gray pre-dawn of the break room and lay there for a moment with the phone on her chest and the knowledge of it settling through her. At 5:30, she got up, washed her face in the bathroom, changed into clean scrubs that Desmond had left in a bag outside the break room door. No note, just the bag, because Desmond had known she'd need them and had gone and gotten them and hadn't made it into a thing, and went to check on Webb. He was awake. He'd been awake for a while, she could tell. The specific alertness of someone who'd been lying in the dark, thinking rather than sleeping. He looked at her when she came in with the expression of a man who had something to say and had been waiting for the right moment to say it. Frick, he said, in custody, 4 this morning. He nodded. Something in him settled, not relief exactly, more like the physical release of a sustained tension, the body responding to information the mind had been waiting for. When the indictments come through, he said, your name is going to be in them. As a material witness, maybe more than that. He looked at her directly. You understand what that means for your position here? I understand. The hospital, the community. Some people aren't going to be comfortable with the person who was part of bringing down their director. I know. She pulled the chair to the bedside. I grew up in a town smaller than this. I know how that works. Does that bother you? She thought about it honestly, which meant taking a moment before answering rather than deflecting with something that sounded better than the truth. Parts of it, she said. Yes. She looked at him. But I also know that the woman who filed the 2019 complaint has been living with a dismissed record for 6 years. and whatever comes for me is smaller than what she's been carrying. She paused. So, Webb looked at her for a long moment. I want to say something. Okay. In Coast, those 8 minutes. He stopped, started again. The way he was speaking was different from before, less operational, more effortful, the way it was when someone was putting words to something they'd been carrying without language for a long time. I was barely conscious. Same as last night. I knew someone was there, working on me. I couldn't see well, but I could hear the way you were directing people. The tone. He paused. I knew we were going to make it because of the tone. She didn't say anything. I looked for the record afterward, he said. Staff Sergeant Calloway. I couldn't access most of it. I knew you'd left the service. I didn't know where you'd gone. He looked at the window. 8 years later, I end up bleeding out in your ER. That's quite a coincidence, she said. I don't believe in coincidences. I believe in them when the alternative explanation is more complicated, she said. You were shot in a town I live in. I work nights. I was the nurse on. That's a lot of factors before you get to fate. Something crossed his face, almost a smile, more genuine than the one from yesterday that had hurt him. Fair. She checked his drain, updated the chart, stood to go. At the door, she paused with her hand on the frame, the way she'd paused in Webb's doorway before, and something that had been sitting in the back of her mind since the break room made itself heard. Webb. She turned. The name you gave me. The one at the top. Aldrich Doan. He said it without hesitation. Curl gave Rourke 11 names. I want you to confirm. She stopped. She looked at him. Something had changed in his face. Not dramatically. He hadn't gone pale, hadn't stiffened. But a quality had entered his expression that she'd seen before, in exactly the kind of situation she hoped she was wrong about right now. The quality of a person who has just heard something that confirms a fear they'd been suppressing. 11 names, he said. Yes. Rourke told you 11. Farr confirmed it at the 6:30 meeting. Webb was quiet for 2 seconds. What were the 11? She didn't have them memorized. She had 4 or 5. She listed them. He listened to each one. When she was done, he said, Doan wasn't on that list. No, she said. He wasn't. Then Curl didn't give them Doan. She stood in the doorway. The ICU was doing its early morning things, quiet and functional, the overnight shift completing its last hour. The soldier outside the room was standing with the steady patience of someone trained to be vertical and alert at 5:30 a.m. Curl knows Doan, Webb said. His voice had gone flat in the way of someone controlling something. Curl's entire operation runs through Doan's network. If Curl is cooperating and Doan's name isn't on the list, then Curl isn't giving them everything. Or Doan made a deal before Curl did. He looked at her. If Doan has a prior arrangement with the prosecution, if someone in the federal system is protecting him, she felt the shift. The specific shift of a situation that had felt like it was resolving, discovering it, had more architecture than anyone had mapped. I need to call Rourke, she said. You need to call Rourke right now, he said. Because if Doan is ahead of this, he stopped. Started again. His voice was very controlled. Rourke has been running this operation for 18 months. If there's someone inside the federal structure who's been keeping Doan clear. She was already pulling her phone from her pocket. She dialed Rourke. It rang 3 times, 4, which was unusual. Rourke had been answering on 1 ring since yesterday morning. 5 rings. 6. Voicemail. She looked at the phone. She called again. Voicemail. She texted, call me, now, urgent. She looked at Webb. He was watching her with the stillness of a man who understood exactly what the unanswered phone meant. She walked to the door and said to the soldier, Where is Agent Rourke? Last I knew, sir, ma'am, she was in the administrative wing. Can you raise her? He tried his radio. Static. The building interference, the concrete and steel. He tried again, got a response from someone else. Another soldier, east entrance. That soldier's response came back clipped and short. Agent Rourke's vehicle is in the parking lot. She hasn't been seen in the building in approximately 40 minutes. The ICU corridor was the same corridor it had always been. The fluorescent light above the second door was still flickering. Nobody had fixed it yet. The cart that had been near the nurse's station last night was in the same position. Everything was exactly as it had been. And Agent Diana Rourke, who had answered her phone on the first ring for 22 consecutive hours, was not answering, and her car was in the parking lot, and nobody had seen her in 40 minutes. Mara looked at the phone in her hand. She looked at the corridor. She looked at Webb's room, where Webb was watching her through the glass with the expression of a man who had just done the same math she'd done and arrived at the same answer. She pulled up Farr's number and dialed. It rang once. "I know," Farr said when she picked up. Her voice was tight and very controlled. "I'm already looking. I'm already looking." Those 3 words from Farr carried the specific compression of someone who had been awake for 26 hours and was now running on the particular fuel that fear produced when it was disciplined enough not to become panic. "Where are you?" Mara asked. "East stairwell, 2nd floor." Farr's voice dropped slightly. Her radio is in the administrative wing. "On the floor. We found it 4 minutes ago." Mara was already moving. Someone took it off her. Or she left it deliberately. A pause. Short, meaningful. She was careful. She always worked careful. "The parking lot. Her car is locked. Key's not inside. We're pulling the exterior camera feed now, but the northeast corner of the lot has been dark since 11 p.m. Bulbs out." Another pause. "Convenient." Mara reached the east stairwell door and pushed through it. The stairwell was cold, concrete, the kind of space that hospitals built for function and forgot about. Farr was on the 2nd floor landing, reading glasses still pushed up on her head, phone in one hand, a tablet in the other, looking like a woman who had turned exhaustion into a working condition. "Doan," Mara said. "I know." Farr looked at the tablet screen. Webb was right. Curl's cooperation agreement. It was brokered 6 hours before we brought Curl in, before we even had him as a target. She looked up. Someone in the federal prosecution structure flagged our operation. Someone who knew enough to know Curl was about to be exposed and moved him into a cooperation agreement that specifically excluded Aldrich Doan from the list of named subjects. Who brokered it? We're working on that. Farr's jaw was tight. It's above my clearance level to pull those records directly. I've put in the request. It'll take time we might not have. Mara looked at the stairwell below. If Doan knew about the operation, if someone inside the federal structure was keeping him informed, then he knew Rourke was the lead. He knew what she had. She looked at Farr. He didn't move against Mercer or Voss. He let them absorb the impact. He was protecting himself. And when Rourke got close enough to matter, he moved. She looked at the stairwell door. 40 minutes. She's been missing 40 minutes. In a building with active federal security. Farr was already dialing. Mara didn't wait. She went down the stairs, through the ground floor corridor, out the east entrance into the parking lot, into the cold. The snow had stopped sometime in the night and left everything flat and white and very quiet. The parking lot was half full. The black SUVs in a cluster near the east entrance. Rourke's vehicle at the far edge under the burned-out light. Mara walked to it. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. She wasn't an investigator. She wasn't trained for this. But she'd spent years in environments where reading a scene quickly was the difference between useful and useless. And she looked at Rourke's car the way she'd learned to look at things. The driver's side was closest to a gap between 2 larger vehicles. The gap was about 4 feet wide enough for someone to stand in. The snow on the driver's side of Rourke's car had been partially disturbed, not by weather, which would have been uniform, in a pattern consistent with someone standing there, close, for a period of time. There were 2 sets of tire tracks leading out the gap in the far fence that was supposed to be a service access point, but whose chain lock had been cut at some point recent enough that the cut metal was still bright rather than oxidized. She photographed both with her phone, sent the photos to Farr without a message because the message wasn't necessary. Farr called back in 40 seconds. "I see it. I'm sending it to our vehicle team." A pause. "Mara, I need you to go back inside. I need you inside with Webb. If Doan is burning everything down, if Rourke was taken because she was the lead, then Webb is still the material witness. He's still the person whose testimony is the foundation of everything that doesn't already have a signed confession. Her voice was even, not pleading, not commanding, just factual, which was more effective than either. I need someone I trust in that room. Mara looked at the tire tracks. She looked at the cut fence. She thought about Rourke, competent, careful, the woman who'd answered on one ring for 22 hours and had clearly known, at some level, that this operation had more risk than what was visible on its surface. She went back inside. Webb was exactly where she'd left him, which meant he hadn't slept, which meant he'd been lying in the dark with the same calculation she'd been running in the parking lot. "Well?" he said when she came in. She told him what she'd found. He listened with his eyes on the ceiling and his hand still on the blanket, and when she was done he said nothing for a moment, which was the response of someone processing rather than someone without a response. "Doan has 2 properties in Montana," he said, "registered to shell companies. I found them during the operation but didn't have enough to include them in the file. One is a ranch property outside of Harker, about 30 miles north. The other is a cabin further up, near the state forest boundary." He looked at her. He wouldn't use the ranch. Too accessible. The cabin is off a Forest Service road that isn't on most maps. "How do you know about it?" "Because I spent 3 months doing nothing but mapping this network." He said it simply. "I know properties that aren't in the file because I was still building the case when the file was taken." "I need to call FAR." "You need to call Marsh," he said. "FAR is FBI. This is a federal extraction situation. Marsh has the tactical assets in this building right now." She looked at him. He was right, which was the mildly frustrating thing. She pulled up Marsh's number. Marsh answered immediately. She talked. He listened, and she could hear in his listening the particular quality of someone for whom this kind of information was not overwhelming. It was just the new shape of the problem, and problems had solutions, and you moved to the solution. "The cabin coordinates," he said. She put the phone to Webb. Webb gave him the property description, the approximate location, the Forest Service road designation he'd pulled from county land records 14 months ago. Marsh asked 2 clarifying questions, got answers, and ended the call. In the 12 minutes that followed, the east parking lot of Cascade Valley Medical Center went from quiet to not quiet. 2 military vehicles that had been positioned near the entrance moved. A third came from somewhere Mara hadn't tracked. She watched it from Webb's window. The organized, rapid movement of people who'd been trained to move quickly and had been waiting for a reason to. "Marsh is going himself?" she asked. "He doesn't send people places he won't go." Webb shifted, uncomfortable, and she could see what it cost him, not just physically. "Rourke is—" He stopped. "She's been on this for 18 months. She's thorough. She's good at reading situations before they turn. If Doan got to her—" "She left the radio deliberately," Mara said. "FAR thinks so." He looked at her. "That's either a bad sign or a very good one." "It's a signal. If she had time to leave it and had it together enough to make it deliberate, she wasn't surprised. She saw it coming and went anyway, or went because she saw it coming." Mara looked at the window. She knew where she was going. She left a marker. He was quiet for a moment. "You think she followed someone?" "I think she's been running this operation for 18 months and she identified something, a person, a vehicle, a pattern, and made a field decision to follow it rather than call it in. Because calling it in through compromised channels would warn him." Webb looked at her with the expression of someone who was revising an assessment in real time. "She knows about Doan." "She knew. She's been working around the protection he has inside the structure." Mara turned from the window. The cooperation agreement that excluded him. She couldn't challenge it directly without tipping her hand, so she was building toward him from the outside, through the chain, through Voss and Mercer and Frick. Yes. And when Curl came in and the agreement already excluded Doan, she stopped, put it together. She knew someone had moved. She knew Doan was repositioning, and she went after him before he could fully disappear. "Alone," Webb said. The word had weight in it. "She wouldn't be the first person in this building to do something alone that should have had more backup," Mara said. She wasn't trying to be pointed about it. It just came out true. He was quiet. The next 2 hours were the hardest kind. The kind where the action was happening somewhere else, and the only thing available was waiting, which was its own discipline. Mara checked Webb's vitals, updated the chart, went to the break room and stood at the coffee machine and thought about Rourke sitting across a diner booth 4 hours ago telling her she needed to know what she wanted before someone decided for her. She poured the coffee, drank half, poured it out because it was terrible. At 7:52 a.m., her phone rang. Marsh. "We have her," he said. The relief was physical, a release of tension across her shoulders she hadn't noticed she was holding. "Is she—" "She's fine." Walked out of the tree line when she heard the vehicles. A pause that had something in it she couldn't quite read. She'd been in the cabin for an hour and 40 minutes. Voluntarily. Very much so. Another pause. "Doan is in custody. She'd already secured him by the time we got there. She used his own flex cuffs." A beat. "He had 2 men with him. They're—" He paused again. "They elected not to engage with the team. Smart of them. Significantly." She could hear movement in the background, vehicles, the specific ambient sound of a situation wrapping up in the cold Montana morning. "Mara, she wants to talk to you." A rustling, and then Rourke's voice, slightly hoarse, the hoarseness of cold and exertion rather than strain, and underneath it something that was as close to unguarded as Mara had heard from her. "The tire tracks," Rourke said. "I saw them. I was hoping someone would see them. You left the radio so we'd pull the parking lot camera and find the gap. The camera on the northeast corner has been dark for 2 weeks. I noticed it last month when I was setting up the operation detail here. I thought it was just negligence." A pause. "Last night, when I saw the vehicle in the gap, I understood it wasn't negligence." "You recognize this vehicle?" "I recognized the driver from a photograph in Doan's financial records." A pause. "I couldn't call it in on a compromised channel, and I couldn't let him leave." She stopped for a moment. "I want you to know I knew the risk. I made the decision with full information." "You could have gotten a message to Marsh." "I had about 4 minutes." Her voice was dry. "I used 2 of them on the radio." Mara stood in the break room with the terrible coffee smell and the refrigerator hum and thought about 2 minutes and a calculated decision and a woman walking toward a fence gap in a dark parking lot because the alternative was letting something irreplaceable drive away. "Rourke." "Yes." "Are you actually okay?" A pause. Not long. "I'm cold," she said. "And I'm going to need about 14 hours of sleep and a conversation with my supervisor that I'm not looking forward to." Another pause, shorter. "But yes, I'm okay." The call ended. Mara set her phone on the break room counter and stood there for a moment with her hands flat on the surface. Outside the window, Harker was waking up, the snow-covered parking lot catching the early sun at an angle that made everything look briefly clean, the way winter mornings could make a place look like a version of itself that hadn't been complicated yet. She picked up her phone and went back to work. The rest of that day and the days that followed had the quality of aftermath. Not the dramatic kind, but the grinding, necessary kind, where the architecture of what had happened got mapped and documented and made into the kind of record that could be used, and that grinding work was its own form of justice, even when it wasn't satisfying to watch. Aldrich Doan was 54 years old and had been, for the previous 19 years, one of the most visible civic contributors in northern Montana, a man whose name appeared on conservation grants and local business development funds, and a scholarship that had sent 47 students to state universities. He was also the operational center of a corruption network that had moved approximately $12 million through property transactions in 4 counties over 15 years, had suppressed at least 9 formal misconduct complaints against officers in his network, had ordered the surveillance of a federal asset, and had, through a connection inside the federal prosecution structure that took another 3 weeks to fully identify, delayed, diluted, and partially redirected an 18-month federal investigation. The connection inside the structure was a senior attorney in the U.S., attorney's office in Great Falls, a man named Patrick Solano, who had been, 23 years earlier, a law school classmate of Doan's and had maintained a relationship that existed in the careful space between friendship and arrangement. Solano had not taken money. He had taken information, a different currency, harder to trace, easier to rationalize. He had flagged the operation's progress to Doan 3 times in 18 months, which had given Doan time to move assets, restructure shell companies, and crucially, move Curl into a cooperation agreement that excluded him before Curl could be pressured into naming him. When Solano was identified and confronted, he resigned within the hour. His resignation did not protect him from the charges that followed. Mara learned most of this in pieces. From Farr, who had a habit of delivering information in person rather than by phone, appearing at the nurse's station with the look of someone who believed that the people who'd been part of something deserved to know how it resolved. From Rourke, who called her twice in the following week with updates that were precise and stripped of anything editorial. From the news, which covered the story with the particular intensity of local media covering something that had happened in their own community and couldn't be made abstract. The coverage was complicated, not in the way corruption coverage was always complicated. The network was real, the evidence was documented, the charges were specific. It was complicated because Cascade Valley Medical Center was a community institution, and Gerald Voss had built parts of it that were real and good, and the people who'd benefited from the scholarship fund and the East Wing expansion and 22 years of a functioning hospital had to hold that alongside the other things, which was genuinely hard and which Mara didn't think they should be expected to resolve quickly. She didn't resolve it quickly herself. The video from the waiting room, the patient with the phone, the shaking footage of the supply cart moving and Mercer's silhouette and the frozen tableau of 11 people who didn't know what to do, had reached, by the end of the first week, a number that the local news station reported with the slightly breathless quality of people encountering scale they weren't used to. The comments were what comments usually were, but the messages, the direct messages that came to the hospital's public contact, that came to Desmond's posted work contact, that eventually found their way to Mara through Rourke, who forwarded them without editorial comment. Those were different. A woman in Billings who'd had a complaint dismissed in 2021. A man in Cutter County who'd been pressured during a property dispute to withdraw a formal grievance. A nurse in a different hospital who described a situation that rhymed with Mara's in its structure. The accusation, the swift institutional compliance, the loneliness of standing in a parking lot at 1 a.m. wondering if she'd done something wrong. She hadn't done something wrong. Neither had any of them. The system had been arranged to make them feel like they had, because a system arranged that way was easier to maintain than one that took the complaint seriously. The woman from the 2019 complaint, the traffic stop, the 40 minutes, the video that disappeared, contacted Rourke's office directly after the story broke. Her name was Teresa Anand. She was 34 years old, worked as an accountant in Harker, had filed the complaint because someone had told her she should, and had spent 3 years afterward wishing she hadn't because of what the process had cost her in time and anxiety, and the particular exhaustion of being disbelieved by people with institutional authority. When the Misconduct Review Board was reconstituted under federal oversight, and her case was pulled for re-examination, she gave a statement that was, by all accounts, precise and devastating, and delivered without drama, which was its own form of courage. The courage of someone who had already done the hard emotional work and was now just delivering the facts. Mercer's suspension became termination. The criminal charges, civil rights violations, obstruction, conspiracy, were filed in federal court in Great Falls. His department issued a statement that used the words accountability and trust with the frequency of an institution trying to perform contrition faster than it could manufacture it. The chief was not charged, but the investigation into what he'd known and when produced enough documentation to prompt a separate review by the state attorney general, which was ongoing. Frick was charged separately. His connection to the courier's accident, Sandra Pike, who was recovering in Billings and had already given a recorded statement that was described by the federal prosecutor as among the most detailed and useful witness accounts she had handled in a decade, was the charge that carried the most weight legally and in terms of public attention. Running a federal witness off a highway was not subtle. It was the kind of act that made the abstract concrete, that turned corruption network from a phrase into something with a body and broken collarbone attached. Voss's case was the most complex legally and the least complex morally. His lawyer argued cooperation and context and 22 years of genuine civic contribution, all of which was true and none of which was sufficient. The forensic accounting of what had moved through the hospital's administrative structure, the administrative holds, the credential requests, the suppressed reports, was documented with the thoroughness that Farr brought to everything she did. Voss took a plea agreement that included full cooperation with the ongoing investigation, restitution, and a sentence that his lawyer described as fair, and that the families of the woman in the 2019 complaint and the others in similar situations described differently. Nobody who'd been on the wrong end of this got everything they wanted from the outcome. That was the honest thing. Justice, when it came through institutional processes, almost never felt as complete as the harm had felt, because harm was immediate and institutional response was slow and carried the marks of its own imperfection. Teresa Anand said something about this in an interview with a Great Falls newspaper that Farr forwarded to Mara without comment. "I don't feel vindicated. I feel like something that should have happened 6 years ago is happening now, and I'm glad it's happening, and I'm still angry that it took this long." The reporter had apparently expected something more redemptive. Teresa Anand gave her something more true. Mara read that interview 3 times. Her own formal statement process took 4 sessions over 2 weeks. 2 with Rourke's team, 1 with the federal prosecutor's office, 1 with the independent review board that was examining the hospital's administrative conduct. She told the same story each time with the same specificity, which was easier than it sounded because the events were clear in her memory in the way that high-stakes events were clear. Not perfectly, not photographically, but structurally, the shape of the thing preserved even when the smaller details blurred. In the 3rd session, the prosecutor's representative asked her, "Did you consider at any point simply stepping back and allowing law enforcement to handle the situation in the trauma bay?" She looked at him for a moment. He was young, mid-30s, careful suit, the expression of someone asking a question he already knew the legal implications of. "He was in shock," she said. "His pressure was 60 over palp. If I'd stepped back, he would have arrested and died within 15 minutes. She paused. There wasn't a version of that situation where stepping back was a medical option. So no. Were you aware that your actions might be interpreted as obstruction? I was aware that a man with a badge was telling me to stop treating a dying patient. She kept her voice level. I made a clinical decision. I stand by it. He wrote something. Thank you, Nurse Calloway. She stood, and she was at the door when he said, For what it's worth, the clinical record supports everything you've described. Your intervention is documented as the proximate reason the patient survived long enough to be secured. He looked up from his notes. I thought you should hear that from this office. She nodded once and went out. The formal reinstatement came 3 weeks after the arrest, packaged in institutional language that was careful and thorough and somewhat beside the point by then, because she'd been working her shifts since the morning after the arrests, and the hospital had not, in practice, treated her as anything other than a staff nurse doing her job. But the paper mattered, not because paper was the thing that had been damaged, but because it was the form that institutional acknowledgement took. And institutional acknowledgement, even when it was late and insufficient, was better than its absence. The hospital's interim director, brought in from a regional health system while the board underwent its own review, called her into the office and told her, in the earnest manner of someone trying to do better, and conscious that doing better was the bare minimum, that the hospital owed her more than a reinstatement letter. He offered her the charge nurse position that was open in the ER. She asked for a week to think about it. She took 6 days. She spent 2 of them on a hiking trail north of Harker, the one that ran along the ridge above the tree line and gave you 40 miles of visibility on a clear day. And she walked until her legs said something and then kept walking, because walking was the activity she'd used for most of her adult life to sort things that thinking alone couldn't sort. What she kept coming back to was not the trauma bay or the parking lot or the break room or any of the specific locations of the past several weeks. She kept coming back to Teresa Anand's line. I'm glad it's happening, and I'm still angry that it took this long. The anger was real. It wasn't clean or cathartic. It was the dull, low-grade anger of someone who understood that the system that had allowed Boyd Mercer to operate for 8 years with suppressed complaints and a protected record was not a unique system. It existed in variations across other counties, other departments, other hospitals, other institutions where the people with the authority to document misconduct had reasons, financial, professional, personal, to make the documentation disappear. The specific network in Harker had been dismantled. The conditions that allowed it to form were broader than one town. She wasn't sure what to do with that anger. She knew it was not the kind that resolved. It was the kind you learned to carry in a way that was useful rather than consuming, which was a discipline she'd been practicing in various forms since her first deployment. On the 5th day, she called Webb. He'd been transferred to a VA medical facility for continued recovery 3 days after the arrests, and the transfer had been quiet and smooth. A medical transport, Marcia's people, the kind of exit that didn't draw attention. He was doing well by the clinical measures. She'd read his transfer summary because she'd been his nurse, and she had the access and the professional reason. And the summary was accurate if somewhat spare on the details of what doing well looked like for a man who'd taken 3 bullets and lost about a third of his blood volume. He answered on the second ring. Calloway. How's the drain? Out, he said. 4 days ago. I can breathe without the specific sensation of something that shouldn't be there being there. A pause. It's a significant improvement. Are you actually doing PT, or are you doing the thing where you go through the motions and then do twice as much independently and aggravate the healing tissue? A pause that was slightly too long. I'm doing PT, he said. Webb. I'm predominantly doing PT. You're going to tear something. I appreciate the concern. She could hear, underneath the deflection, that he was in better spirits than the last time she'd seen him, which was something. How are you? I've been offered a promotion. Take it. I'm considering it. What's to consider? She thought about how to say the thing she'd been walking herself toward for 5 days. If I take a charge nurse position, I spend less time with patients. She paused. I'm good with patients. You're better than good. I know. She said it without arrogance. It was just accurate. But charge nursing is also where you set the tone for an entire floor. How complaints get documented, whether the protocols that exist on paper actually get followed, whether a nurse who sees something wrong feels like they can say it. She paused. Whether someone in a waiting room with a head wound gets seen in time. Webb was quiet for a moment. You're taking it. I'm taking it. Good. Another pause, more weighted. Mara, the review board, the reconstituted oversight structure for officer misconduct. They've asked me to provide input on the new protocols. As an outside consultant, he paused. I put your name in as a potential community representative, medical sector. Your response to the misconduct event in the trauma bay is documented in detail. Your perspective on how medical institutions interface with law enforcement complaints would be, Webb? Yes. Give me a month, she said. Let me get through the transition first. A month, he said. You'll get a formal request. I know. She looked at the ridgeline, the 40 miles of gray-blue Montana distance. I'll answer it. She accepted the charge nurse position on a Tuesday morning, which was an ordinary kind of day. Overcast, cold, a pediatric intake in the morning, and a chest pain workup in the afternoon that turned out to be costochondritis and sent a 50-year-old man home relieved and slightly embarrassed. She updated the floor protocols for the documentation of unauthorized access to patient areas, cross-referencing with the security team's procedures in a way that hadn't existed before. She set up a direct line between the ICU nursing station and the hospital's legal counsel for emergency documentation holds, the kind that required a warrant number and a callback confirmation rather than an administrator's phone call at 3 a.m. Small things, procedural things, the kind of changes that didn't make news and didn't produce the particular relief of a courtroom moment, but that existed in the structure of a place where people came when they were most vulnerable, and where the difference between a system that protected them and a system that could be leveraged against them lived in the details. Desmond, when she told him about the charge nurse role, said, I should have said something that night, when they walked you out. She looked at him. He'd been carrying that for weeks, she could see, not in a debilitating way, but in the way people carried things they hadn't been able to put down yet. You had 11 other patients, she said. It's not an excuse, it's a fact. She looked at him directly. The fact that speaking up felt costly enough that you didn't, that's not a character flaw, that's a system problem. We're fixing the system. She paused. You've been here 12 years. You know how things should work. Now you're going to help make sure they do. He looked at her for a long moment, nodded once, went back to his chart. Priya stopped her in the corridor at the end of that shift. The young physician who'd stood across a dying patient and shaken slightly when a sergeant shoved a nurse in front of him, and who had nonetheless reported what he'd seen in the bay, and who had nonetheless told her about Mercer's presence in the building, in the small specific ways that people contributed to outcomes that were larger than any single act. "I've been offered a trauma fellowship," he said. "Billings." "Take it," she said. He looked at her. "You don't think I need more time here first?" "I think you're good enough that a better training environment is better for your patients than a comfortable one." She looked at him. "You reported the unauthorized access. You noticed something wrong and you said it to someone. That's not nothing." She paused. "Don't let anybody make you feel like it is." He straightened slightly, nodded. She went to get her coat. The formal military acknowledgement came 6 weeks later, in the form of a letter, physical, on headed paper, the kind of letter that used language she recognized from her own time in service. Commendation, distinguished service, the formal vocabulary of an institution expressing the debt it had incurred. It referenced the evacuation in Coast Province and separately the events at Cascade Valley Medical Center, and it was signed by someone several ranks above Colonel Marsh, which she noticed without being particularly moved by. What moved her was the handwritten note at the bottom. Not Marsh's handwriting, she didn't have his for comparison, but the handwriting of someone who'd added it after the official language was already set. It said, "You held the line when it mattered. Some people spend their whole career trying to do that once." She put the letter in her locker, next to the photo of her brother and the lucky quarter she'd been keeping since her 3rd deployment. Sergeant the Cat was waiting when she got home, unimpressed by her extended hours and communicating this through the medium of sitting directly in front of his empty bowl and looking at her with the specific patience of an animal that understood leverage. She fed him. She made tea. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the street below, where Harker was doing its ordinary things. A car scraping ice from a windshield, someone walking a dog, the morning light coming through cloud cover in the way it came through in Montana, diffuse and specific at once. She thought about the night it started, the gurney coming through the doors, the particular sound of a supply cart skating across tile, the 14 people in a room who froze, and the one who didn't. She thought about what she'd said to Webb on the phone, about being good with patients. She was. She wasn't modest about it. False modesty was just another form of inaccuracy, and she'd spent enough time in environments where inaccuracy killed people to have lost tolerance for it even in its polite forms. She was good because she'd been trained and because she'd practiced and because she cared about what happened to the people on those gurneys in a way that hadn't diminished in 7 years of civilian nursing, even when the system around that caring had sometimes made the caring feel like a liability. She thought about Teresa Anand. "I'm glad it's happening, and I'm still angry that it took this long." She thought about the woman who'd been in the waiting room for 3 hours with a towel against her head wound. She thought about the 6-year-old girl in Bay 2 whose lips had been going blue, and whose mother's face in relief had been worth something that didn't have a number. The work was not glamorous. The system it happened inside was not just. The people doing it were not heroes. They were tired, imperfect, sometimes afraid, sometimes wrong, doing the best they could with the information and the time and the resources they had, which was never quite enough and was always what was available. What had happened in Cascade Valley Medical Center was not a story about one nurse and one corrupt sergeant. It was a story about what happens when the machinery that was built to protect people gets quietly repurposed to protect the people who run it, and about what it costs to push back against that machinery, and about who pays that cost and who doesn't, and about the specific kind of silence that systems rely on. The silence of people who see something and calculate, correctly, that speaking up will cost more than staying quiet. The people in that waiting room who froze, she didn't blame them. She'd been in enough situations to know that freezing was not cowardice. It was the body's honest response to being presented with something it hadn't prepared for. What mattered was what happened after the freeze. The person who eventually sent the text, "I saw everything. I didn't say anything because I was scared. I'm not scared anymore," had frozen first, then unfrozen. That was also what people did. The tea was cold. She'd been standing at the window for longer than she'd noticed. She thought about the night they'd walked her out. The two security guards, not unkind, just positioned, and the automatic doors closing behind her with that sound like an exhale. She'd sat in her car in the parking lot for 3 minutes and felt the specific weight of being made small by people who had no idea what they were dealing with. The thing was, and she'd turned this over for weeks, trying to find the version of it that was simply true without being a lesson or a platitude. The thing was that she had known, even in those 3 minutes, that it wasn't the end of anything. Not because she'd been confident about the outcome. She hadn't been. She'd been suspended, publicly escorted out, accused of obstruction by a man with institutional backing and a legal team and a network she didn't fully understand yet. The outcome had been genuinely uncertain, but she'd known it wasn't the end because she'd been in situations where the situation was genuinely trying to end her, and this was not that. A supply cart and a parking lot and a hospital that had made the wrong call under pressure, these were things that could be addressed. Not easily, not without cost, but they had addresses. They could be found and walked toward. She'd learned that somewhere between her first deployment and her second, in the specific school of having no good options and choosing anyway, of understanding that fear was information and not instruction, of watching people in impossible positions find the one thing they could do and do it until there was another thing to do. She was still learning it. She expected to keep learning it. She poured the cold tea down the drain and made a fresh cup. Her shift started in 4 hours. There were patients who had come through the doors of Cascade Valley Medical Center tonight who were afraid, or in pain, or confused, or alone. And some of them would be in rooms where the difference between someone who saw them clearly and someone who processed them efficiently would determine something more than a chart notation. She intended to see them clearly. That was the job. It always had been. Before the deployment, during it, after it, before the parking lot and the supply cart and the federal vehicles and the warrant and the 40 miles of Montana visibility from the ridge above the tree line. Before all of that, and after all of it, the job was the same. She drank her tea, she put on her coat, she went back to work.